Attorney General Bill Barr recently made big headlines for saying that some members of the FBI may have been more than just sloppy, as James Comey said. Barr said it may have been more than that. He said he wanted to know if they had acted in, quote, bad faith when they launched an investigation into the Trump campaign. That and other bold moves have earned him a barrage of criticism from the left. But he doesn't seem to mind. I traveled with the Attorney General as he went to Detroit to launch a major new crime-fighting effort in America's cities. And I asked him about those attacks and about the president who was just hours away at the time from impeachment. Here's part one of our conversation. Attorney General Barr, thank you for sitting down with me today.
Thank you for having me.
So by the time this airs this evening, it's expected that the president will be impeached by the House of Representatives of the United States. What do you think about that?
Well, as I've said, it's a constitutional political process that's underway right now, and the Department of Justice isn't part of that. And so it's premature for me to comment on impeachment at this point. When
you listen to the call, do you think that it was perfect, as the president says?
Well, I'm not going to get into, if issues come up later and I have to deal with them, I don't want to, be discussing the facts.
With regard to Ukraine, which obviously is at the center of this, the impeachment push, Rudy Giuliani just got back from Ukraine again. He's still investigating on behalf of the president there, who may have been trying to get at him in 2016. Do you think that's a good idea, that Rudy Giuliani is investigating that in Ukraine?
Well, I'm responsible for the Department of Justice, and obviously I will rely on investigations conducted by the department, and I think that's generally the best way to go.
Do you think he's stepping on your turf?
I wouldn't say that, but as I say, I think it's in everyone's interest to allow the Department of Justice to do its work and the other U.S. intelligence agencies.
He said in an interview that he needed to get Marie Yovanovitch out of the way, that she was going to make investigations difficult for everybody. And he firmly believes that there was a Ukraine conspiracy with the DNC against President Trump. Do you have any indication that there was one?
Well, as I've said, I have not looked at all into the, whatever the Ukrainian aspects are of the 2016 election, I have not gotten into them at all. And I don't know whether John Durham has gotten into them. So because that is a matter that is potentially going to be covered by the investigation, I don't want to speculate.
Are you interested in seeing the evidence that Rudy Giuliani has been gathering in Ukraine?
The Department of Justice is interested in seeing all evidence that could be relevant.
Does the DOJ have any plan to investigate Joe Biden or CrowdStrike or Ukraine and the DNC server or Burisma? Are any of those on your radar?
Again, I don't want to speculate about what Durham may or may not get into. I don't know what he is.
But currently, none of those issues are under investigation.
I mean, I couldn't say one way or the other, but you shouldn't read anything into that.
Jim Comey came out after you gave your last interview. You responded to the IG Horowitz's report and spoke out about that. And then he spoke with Chris Wallace, and he said that the 17 mistakes and omissions that were uncovered in the FISA process he attributed it to sloppiness, largely. What do you say to that?
I think there's some of them very hard to square with the idea that these were just mistakes and sloppiness. I have said that a number of these episodes leave open the possibility of inferring bad faith or improper motive, but I hasten to add that, as I've said all along, that I've reached no determination on that, nor do I think a final determination on that is appropriate until all the evidence is in. The Horowitz himself, in his testimony, I think pretty well summed it up, which is this could be, on the one hand, at the very least, gross incompetence. On the other hand, it could also be improper motive. And he was not in a position to make that call, and that's why we have the U.S. Attorney John Durham looking into this.
Yeah, and I want to ask you more about that in a moment. Are you surprised that James Comey is so convinced himself that all of this was completely above board? He came out and said there was no treason, there's no spying at all on the president.
Well, I think the IG report and the recent letter from the FISA court, I think, pulls the rug out from under that analysis. There was serious misconduct, as the court itself has said. And one of the things that I object to is the tack being taken by Comey, which is to suggest that people who are criticizing or trying to get to the bottom of the misconduct are somehow attacking the FBI. I think that's nonsense. We're criticizing and concerned about misconduct by a few actors at the top of the FBI, and they should be criticized if they engage in serious misconduct. That doesn't mean we're criticizing the FBI, and I think the tack of trying to wrap yourself in the institution and say, gee, people who are criticizing the decisions I made are attacking the institution. I notice people don't do that as far as I'm concerned. People feel free to criticize me, and I don't say, gee, you're attacking the honest men and women of the Department of Justice. I think leaders, have to own their decisions and are fair game if they make bad decisions.
I want you to listen to this piece of his interview with Chris Wallace and get your reaction.
He does not have a factual basis as the Attorney General of the United States to be speculating that agents acted in bad faith. The facts just aren't there. Full stop. That doesn't make it any less consequential, any less important, but that's an irresponsible statement.
He said that you made an irresponsible statement about these FBI individuals.
Yeah. Well, as I said, I made the same statement effectively and substantively as the Inspector General, which is there are unexplained misconduct that it just can't be easily explained as to what was going on there. And as he said, it could involve bad motive, and he was not in a position, given the limited scope he has, of making that final determination. So it's not speculation, but I think there are episodes there that simply cannot be squared with innocent mistakes, and I think people have to come to terms with that.
Were you surprised that he seemed to give himself such distance from the entire operation?
As a director sitting on top of an organization of 38,000 people, you can't run an investigation that's 7 layers below you. You have to leave it to the career professionals to do.
Do you believe that?
No. I think that one of the problems with what happened was precisely that they pulled the investigation up to the executive floors, and it was run and bird-dogged by a very small group of very high-level officials. And the idea that this was 7 layers below him is simply not true.
He also said that he told the president 3 times that he was not the target of the investigation. Do you believe, based on what we know now, that the president was not the target of Crossfire Hurricane or wasn't one of them?
Well, I think effectively the president was being investigated. They were investigating the Trump campaign and Trump associates. But again, as I've said, what happened after the election to me is very questionable, and I think there has to be a lot of focus as to what happened after the campaign, and they learned that their whole case had collapsed, and they really had no basis to take it further. And so we are looking into that.
Do you think we need to reform the FISA court system? Some people are even calling for it to be removed because there's no opportunity for the person who's presenting the evidence to have another side make the argument for why this surveillance perhaps should not be done.
No, I don't think we need to do anything that radical. I think both Chris Wray and I take the problems and the misconduct of the past very seriously, and Chris has been particularly proactive in developing a number of reforms that are designed to address that, and I'm evaluating those and considering some additional steps. But I think we can deal with it without throwing the baby out with the bathwater. FISA is a critical tool for protecting the country.
The former FBI director was also CIA director, William Webster, also spoke out in the last day or so. He wrote an editorial and then did an interview. And in the editorial, he was very tough on the president. But he also said about you that your charges of bias within the FBI, made without providing any evidence and in direct dispute with the findings of the nonpartisan Inspector General, risk inflicting enduring damage on this critically important institution. He said that he's a friend of yours as well, longtime friend. What do you say about that?
Well, I think, Judge Webster was brought in as the FBI director under similar circumstances to sort of clean up previous problems, and he was very tough in doing it. And the Judge Webster I know is focused on getting to the bottom of things so they can be properly addressed. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find out what were the problems and address it going forward. The op-ed piece does make a few references to things that I allegedly said, which I didn't say. In other words, I don't mind being criticized for things I actually say, but I don't like being criticized for things that I didn't say. And so, I have not charged the FBI with political bias. I've said that in looking at the conduct of the people who ran this investigation at the very top of the Bureau, it is possible that there was improper motivation, but we have to wait for all the facts to get in.
So the answers to that question are expected to come in John Durham's investigation.
Yeah.
Can you update us on that in terms of how that's going or what the time frame is when we can expect to see that report?
Well, he's moving, very diligently. I'm not involved in the day-to-day work of that. I know in just a general sense what they're looking at, and otherwise it's his investigation, and he runs it as he sees fit. And I haven't given him any timelines, and we haven't discussed a timeline as to when he thought it would be complete. But just my general, there were people who expected it to come a week or two after Horowitz's report. And just based on my general knowledge of the things he's looking at and has to look at in the future, I wouldn't think that he'd be in a position for quite a few months. And
it's a criminal investigation. There are criminal investigation elements to it.
Yes.
Do you know if he has spoken with John Brennan or James Clapper, Andrew McCabe? Are they included in that investigation?
I'm actually not following it closely to know who he's talking to at any
Would you expect that they would be included based on the leadership issues that you have brought up at the intelligence agencies?
I don't want to speculate about how he's going to take the investigation.
So we really learned a lot about the FISA abuse situation in the Inspector General's report. Do you believe that Durham's investigation is broader scoped in terms of the intelligence agencies that are being looked at?
Oh, yes. He's not just looking at the FBI. He's looking at other agencies and also private and departments and also private actors. And so it's a much broader investigation. And also, he's not just looking at the FISA aspect of it. He is looking at all the conduct, both before and after the election.
So would that include the CIA, NSA?
It would include agencies that could have been involved in this, but we're getting a lot of cooperation from those agencies. You have to remember on something like this, part of the reason you do something like this is to deal with some of the various theories that have been thrown out and either show one way or the other whether they're valid or not. So the fact that you're looking into certain allegations doesn't necessarily mean you give them credence. And I think the media understood that when Bob Mueller was doing his work, and they should bear that in mind when they're watching Durham.
Back as my interview with Attorney General William Barr picks up with how the Trump-Russia probe began. I mean, with regard to, for example, George Papadopoulos or Carter Page, who were reached out to prior to the official beginning of this investigation, do you believe that there's reason to think that their theories are accurate, that intelligence individuals who were connected internationally, you went overseas to talk to some of them about this, that they were dangling these agents in front of them and dangling information about Hillary Clinton in order to get an in into the Trump campaign?
Well, I don't want to say anything that would suggest that I agree or have concluded that there was any dangling or reach out done before July. But I think Durham, as far as I understand it, is looking into that pre-July period to determine whether or not that narrative got started, the collusion narrative got started before that. There are two questions about the issue of predication. One is, was in fact the comment by Papadopoulos the real predication, or was it a pretext for a pre-existing desire to take a look at the Trump campaign, and he's looking at all of those issues.
You suggested that the conversation that they had, that George Papadopoulos had in the bar about the potential for Hillary's emails coming out was something that was simultaneously being discussed in so many different venues at that time, publicly and privately, that it was really a very thin thread to go on, right?
Right. At the time the comment was made by Papadopoulos that the Russians might have something that they would drop in the public that was adverse to Hillary, that was rampant during a period of rampant speculation both in the media and in political circles. And it relates to the fact that a lot of people thought that the Russians had probably hacked into Hillary's homebrew server, as they call it, and may have had all her emails and therefore be in a position to drop them. So that statement by itself had very little probative value, and I think to leap to the conclusion that it showed knowledge of a later hack into DNC was a pretty aggressive conclusion. I just think that by the time the president entered office, around that time, it was becoming clear that there was no basis to these allegations, not just the dossier falling apart, but the information that they were relying on as to Page and to Papadopoulos. And so the whole thing, collapsed.
Just to put a bow on the Durham and Comey investigations, if you had been in charge at the FBI at that time and these concerns were brought to you about Papadopoulos, about Page, they were concerned that maybe he was working on the Russian side of the equation, how would you have handled it? What would you have set in motion differently?
Well, as I read the Horowitz report, the three reactions from Attorney General Loretta Lynch, Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, and President Obama appear to have been, well, shouldn't we give him a defensive briefing? And I think that would be the natural impulse for anybody who was interested in getting to the bottom of things quickly and was skeptical of any notion that President Trump's campaign was, in cahoots with the Russians, and also was concerned about protecting the election. If you're interested in protecting the election, you give a defensive briefing.
And why do you think he didn't do that?
We'll see.
That's part of the Durham investigation.
Yes.
So if John Durham were to come back with a report that says that he doesn't think that there was anything untoward in these other intel agencies, and you don't find the things that you have suggested could be there, is that the end of it? Will you let it lie?
I certainly will rely on John. Let me just say that I didn't know John Durham when I appointed him to the position. I think I had met him in passing when I was saying hello to a whole group of new U.S. attorneys, or at least the first time I met the U.S. attorneys. But I only knew him by reputation as, legendary within the department for his fairness and his, doggedness as a prosecutor, and he was widely supported, bipartisan. He had done work for a number of Democratic U.S. attorneys general, and he was supported by the Democratic senators. So sterling reputation as a fair-minded prosecutor. I didn't know him, but based on his reputation, that's the kind of person I wanted running this, and I'll accept what his conclusions are.